Okay, folks, we're going to be looking at Dick Masterson's critique of Isom #1. And the reason I'm looking at this today is because Masterson's critique is usually held up as the gold standard for criticism. This is why Eric July can't take criticism. It's because he won't listen to Dick Masterson's critique. Now, Dick Masterson, along with Vito Gesualdi, is host of the insanely popular show, The Biggest Problem in the Universe. He also has his own show called The Dick Show, which I did not look up a picture for because, dear God, have you ever tried typing anything regarding Dick into a browser and then expecting anything safe for work in the search results? So, yeah, we're not going to go there. But Masterson was challenged because he initially wrote off Isom #1 as being a crappy comic without ever having read it. And so when he was challenged about that and said, look, you really got to read the book before you criticize it like that, then he did, and he made notes, copious notes, loads and loads of notes, pages long notes. And all of this was covered in great detail, and there are people who have their own personal views on those notes, one being Ethan Van Sciver, who has assessed the notes as being great, and Eric July needed to listen to these notes. The notes seem good, they seem valid. Whereas when I went through the notes myself, I found them to be funny, but also 97% useless and wrong and indicative of not having given Isom #1 an actual honest read. Well, which of us is right? Well, to determine that, we're going to have to go through the notes. So here we go. It's going to be a long and bumpy ride. 2 weeks ago? Do not start back in time. Well, this is a reference to the very first page, which starts Isom #1 2 weeks ago. And there actually are perfectly valid reasons to start back in time. I mean, if we were looking back like in the Depression age, or in the age of segregation, or even in the Holy Roman Empire, and then we jump to the future, we would have no problem with that. And I think the complaint here, as some people have presented it, is that when you're dealing with present day circumstances or circumstances approximately at the present day, what you really want to do is start in the now and then do 2 weeks later. I mean, that's the only real objection I've heard, but I don't really see any difference in that, and especially if there is a reason why you're starting in the past 2 weeks ago. The only problem that we're given here is that we're not really given a reason for the 2-week gap. We have some events that start, or a particular event that happens 2 weeks ago. We then skip 2 weeks ahead to the now, and then we're never really given a reason why there had to be this 2-week gap in between. But because it has to do with the character of Yaira, and because it looks like Yaira #1 might be dealing with this 2-week gap, I'm going to hold off on calling this bad storytelling because it might actually be necessary to say that there was this 2-week gap involved. But as for the fact that it starts 2 weeks ago and ends up now, I don't see any real substantive difference between saying it's starting now and then picks up again 2 weeks later. Either one is equally jarring, especially if you're not given a reason, but there could be a valid reason for it, so let's not jump ahead of ourselves and say there isn't. Does earlier mean earlier today or even earlier than 2 weeks ago? And this is a reference to when we pick up in the 2 weeks later portion, we're given the timestamp earlier. Now, this is a valid criticism that earlier is ambiguous and should have been fixed. We have no way of knowing whether or not earlier means earlier today or earlier means earlier that same day 2 weeks ago. Could be either one. Now, Eric July on his live stream has clarified that it does mean earlier today, but live streams don't count. You have to have that information available in the comic book. And by the way, the correct timestamp to use was now. You don't want to say earlier unless you've already established a now somewhere else in the book. And nowhere in the book is now established. So establish now, and now should have been where the earlier was put. Now, no pun intended, we meet Avery, and the internal monologue starts. probably should have started at the beginning of the book to set the scenes. Okay, so the internal monologue is basically the captions that start surrounding Avery after he's gotten off the phone with his sister. Now, I do agree that the beginning of the book does need more text and dialogue and captions, but it doesn't necessarily need to come from any internal monologue. I mean, basically what he's saying here is that on this very first page of Isom number 1, which is dead silent, with the exception of the establishing, the fact that we're outside the police precinct, and then the establishing of the 2 weeks ago timestamp, and that we're in West Florespark, Uptown. We're not actually told what state this is in. Basically, we are given this blank page. And yes, I do agree that this page needed to be filled with stuff, but I don't necessarily agree that it had to be filled with internal monologue. What I think should have happened is have some dialogue from the television on page 2, giving some background for the interview with the governor. So you've got the governor on here talking about how violent crime has decreased 6 months into his term, and we don't know any history, though, and the history could be given in those first 2 panels, that other panel being completely silent as well. Could have said something to the effect, Governor so-and-so, since it's the 20-year anniversary of Texas secession from the United States in the Great War of Separation, how do you feel about how how Texas has come in the last 20 years, and how do you feel that you have contributed to such and such? There's plenty of opportunity here to give exposition in the context of the scene that would make sense. And that's where I think that the opening text on page 1 and page 2 should have come from. Who is the sister if, in Not For Your Sister, Do It For Mrs. Newman? This is referring to the conclusion of Avery's phone call with Altona, his sister, and she says, if not for your sister, do it for Mrs. Newman. Now, it's true that Altona does not specifically identify herself as the sister in question, but, it's pretty easy to intuit that. First of all, there is a huge amount of familiarity that she shares with Avery in their dialogue, and the other thing is she asked first and was rebuffed by him. I mean, she literally said, I need your help. No. Doing it for Mrs. Newman should have less appeal than doing it for family. Well, we soon learn that Mrs. Newman is a friend of Avery's mother. He literally says here, if Mom found out I didn't help her, she'd kill me. And any time parental approval is involved in your character's decision-making, the stakes are raised immensely. That's something that I actually learned in a creative writing class back in college. You cannot assume that a parent, the moment the parents enter the picture, everything goes up to 11. That's basically the default for any particular characters, unless characters are estranged from their parents in some way, and even then, you might see the involvement at least escalate to a level 5 or 6 from a 2 or 3 or something like that. So this is, in a sense, doing it for family, because Mrs. Newman knows his mother and his mother knows him. I'm being told Darren is a bad guy, but I can't see any evidence of it. What is Darren supposed to do? Openly commit a crime in front of Avery? I mean, why is it that we need to have that proven to us? Why does Darren need to have some sort of conversation confirming this information, or can we just basically accept that because, number one, Altona is talking about Darren being a bad guy, and number two, Avery is not contradicting her, that this is in fact a truth? I mean, when we are told about the Kingpin, like talking about Wilson Fisk in the Daredevil comics, do we actually need to see him, engaging in organized crime, or can he be out to dinner in the next scene? It doesn't make sense to me that you have to establish that the characters know what they're talking about, that you don't trust these characters from the beginning. Avery just murdered a bodyguard? Well, then he's no longer the good guy. Well, what is this referring to? Now, I have to say that this is a valid criticism, because in the scene where Avery chest punches a bodyguard, the impact is way overstated. There's far too much blood from both an internal and external perspective. So the scene, we see Avery punch this guy, and now he's got blood flying from his mouth. And it doesn't look like he's actually been punched in the face before that. This is just the effect of him being punched in the chest. And moreover, from an X-ray perspective, which is really supposed to be more metaphorical than anything else, it looks like the guy's lung practically explodes. And moreover, when the guy's lying on the floor, he's lying in a pool of blood. Now, this absolutely would have been a fatal injury, but I don't think anybody was really expecting, I don't think the artist, I don't think Eric July was really expecting that anybody would take it as such. In fact, I just realized from the X-ray perspective that, oh, okay, we're talking metaphor here. But Dick Masterson is right that the external depiction of all of this blood should have been cleaned up. There's no way that Avery didn't kill this guy if all of this is actually resoundingly accurate, especially in terms of the external amount of blood that guy appears to be steeped in the floor. So that is a valid criticism on Dick's part. What is Avery producing at his ranch? We're never told. Seriously? I mean, has anybody in the history of Batman comics really asked, what does the Wayne Foundation actually do? I mean, we know it's this, like, humongous foundation, but do they have, like, an actual product? Do they make widgets or something? Does the Wayne Foundation actually do anything? Does it own hospitals? Does it own textiles? I have no idea what the Wayne Foundation does, and nobody cares. How does the Fantastic Four make their money? We know there's this company that's Fantastic Four Incorporated, but incorporated to do what? Do they license out their unstable molecule recipes? Do they sell off patents and stuff like that? It's just nobody really asks these questions. What's the gross domestic product of Wakanda, for that matter? I mean, we know they trade vibranium, perhaps. They're doing imports and exports in rare minerals, but how do they rank on the Economics Explained leaderboard? Nobody knows that kind of stuff, and the idea that we should have to know what Avery does as a rancher at this point is kind of ludicrous. Why can't the hospital tell if Avery's an accept or remove his ankle bracelet? Well, those are good questions, but not every question has to be answered right away. It's okay for the writer to hold back information if the writer's interest is for you to think about these things and maybe come up with ideas for yourself. I mean, none of this becomes absolutely imperative to the story. His ankle bracelet winds up serving as a sort of GPS that his sister can track, so that she is able to find him when he's out wandering out and about. But that doesn't mean that we have to know everything about the technology that's available to him, or about the nature of his being and the nature of his powers. These are not things that we have to know right away. We know he has superpowers at this point, mostly related to strength and durability, but other than that, we don't really know anything. We don't really need to. Why did Avery run away from the hospital? Well, they wanted to enter him into an accept database, so I'm assuming he had some privacy concerns. They mentioned this database wherein the doctor says, well, just because we couldn't recognize him or identify him, that doesn't mean he isn't an accept. It's not like our database consists of every single special being. So there's a database in which he would rather not be entered, and superheroes generally don't want their identities known. I mean, it's not necessarily true that Avery was a public hero back in the day. Why does Avery get taken to an impound lot for his car? Well, he specifically asks to be taken there because he believes Darren would have had his car removed by the police, or taken to some other lot. I don't know if there's like private impound lots that the police use. But in any case, Avery tells Altona, take me to the nearest impound. And that's because he figures that Darren would have taken his car to wherever that is. Maybe Avery once saw this happen to someone else Darren had trashed. Avery and Darren did used to run together, so maybe Avery is aware of what Darren would do. Why don't the hospital staff call the police? Well, it's possible that they did, but Avery's long gone and they never ID'd him, so what are they going to give? What information are they really going to give to the police? It's possible they didn't because putting Avery on the first floor was dumb. So the doctor is chiding the nurse, saying, "You decided to put him on the first floor knowing that this guy has some powers? How is Club Merc more than just an ordinary bar?" Well, we're never specifically told, but it's implied that Darren is selling more than booze there. In fact, the guy in this particular scene, Avery asks, "Well, do they have girls around the spot? Doesn't look like much of a strip joint." That's because it's not, but that spot is the spot. I doubt drinks are the only thing on the menu. Oh, by the way, this is the scene in which Eric July basically gaslighted me to my face, saying that there was nothing wrong with the italicization of the word "the" in this particular scene. Um, this was where I first basically lost all confidence in his ability to take criticism myself, because when I pointed this out to him that the italicized "the" in the first portion really should have been an italicized "the" in the second portion, he denied it. And I'm like, how are you denying this? This is like the easiest mistake to understand that somebody made, whether it's the letterer or himself. But there's no reason for Avery to have said, "Do they have girls around the spot?" Like, the spot as opposed to what spot? I mean, we know he's talking about Club Merc, but he's not talking about any other kind of spot. It's the other guy who says, "But that spot is the spot." In other words, that Club Merc is where everybody goes. I doubt drinks are the only thing on the menu. So it's kind of obvious the italicization is wrong there, and yet he just flat out lied and said it wasn't. Either that or he just doesn't know how English works. I don't know. It's one of the two. But I lost all confidence in his ability to take criticism at that point. If Avery isn't sure Jasmine is in trouble, why does he continue to look for her? Well, because he's not going back without solid information for Mrs. Newman. Darren basically told him to, lie to the mom and say she's fine, and Avery said, "You expect me to lie to Mrs. Newman? You're on one." And apparently that means you're nuts. I had to look that up. Darren had Avery beaten down rather than simply give Avery the info he wanted. So that's reason also to continue to look for Jasmine. I mean, if you're basically willing to give somebody a beatdown rather than just say, "Oh yeah, she's fine. Here, let me call her for you, and she'll tell you the same thing," then that probably indicates there is a problem. Why doesn't Avery go to the police? Well, because Darren might make things worse for Jasmine if police get involved. That's literally what Avery says. Police might make this worse. Who is this accept couple in the bar, and why should we care about their plans? Well, their involvement implies a future storyline in either Isom or some other title. Part of the stated purpose of Isom #1 is to launch other books. Avery says he has no plan and doesn't seem to have a goal. Well, that's true. But considering he's no detective, what should we expect? I mean, he literally says, "I'm not a detective. This is just a guy who's been thrown into particular circumstances, and he's dealing with them best he can." Avery assaults Jasmine upon seeing her. He doesn't assault her. Oh my god. He puts a hand on the shoulder of a friend of the family who actually recognizes him. I mean, when he says Jasmine, she turns around and says, "Avery?" And then he just basically says, "Hey, I'm not here to judge you. Just let me know if this is involuntary." And that's a comforting hand. That's not an assault. Darren's two men outside acted reasonably in accosting Avery. Well, be that as it may, Avery already has a beef with Darren and his crew, so it doesn't really matter at that point. The fight is based in Avery's mind is already on. Avery should only have attacked Darren's men after giving them a warning. I'm assuming that's referring to the men inside the club, and he literally does that. He says, "Just take me to Darren, and I won't ruin your little get-together." I mean, he's perfectly willing to just go to the big boss and not throw the beat down on any of these guys. Avery says he came to Darren with respect, but in fact, he was disrespectful. Well, Avery was very respectful in sitting with Darren and taking Darren's abuse. I mean, if you look at the body language that Avery is displaying here, I mean, he's being very submissive and just basically taking Darren's crap, even though Darren's being very insulting. Avery was asked by Darren to leave, but he attacked Darren's guards instead. Well, Avery had not yet received sufficient proof from Darren that Jasmine was okay, so he was not leaving. Is she actually all right? Yeah, I need to know. He could have left, but his obligation, plus all of Darren's disrespect, overrode his good sense. I mean, clearly he was angry, and he's still angry over it. Now, does Santuan really believe he would face zero repercussions for killing Avery? Well, possibly, because he apparently believes Darren's influence over the police extends that far. You know, when the police encounter Avery after he defeats Santuan, they know who Santuan is, and they know who he's connected to. And the police are immediately on Santuan's side. So it could be that Santuan is right. I don't understand the mechanics of how Avery defeats Santuan, and this is difficult to pick up. I did not pick this up at first myself, but the fact is Avery combines his own strength plus Yaira's super speed to defeat Santuan. This scene that we see here is him not just using his strength and durability to propel Santuan along, but he's also using Yaira's super speed to crash him through the wall. We're supposed to intuit from Santuan that Avery's having super speed is something new. When he dodges Santuan and then comes and kicks him behind all in one motion, Santuan turns and asks, "Since when could you do that?" So obviously Avery has picked up a new skill, and that new skill was from Yaira. Avery demonstrated superpowers in his fight with Santuan. True. That's because Avery has superpowers, and he can also borrow superpowers. In issue 1, he borrowed them from Yaira. In issue 2, it looks like, from this scene, there's a creature who has the ability to summon up energy from within and spontaneously combust. And Avery borrows that power and turns it into a kind of rocket jump. So here is another demonstration of Avery's ability to borrow powers. It's not something that's explicitly stated, but it's definitely implied by the artwork. Altona says, "Considering who I work for," this is in between the discussion between her and Avery later on. Well, whom does she work for? Well, she works for a company called Projexis, and presumably this company is a big deal, but we're told about who she works for in the first scene that we see her. Does the conversation about Yassi's dead dad need to happen in front of her? Yeah, this is the conversation where Avery is saying, "I know it's been tough on you without Terrell. Well, she's handled this about as well as anybody her age could, but she does ask about you a lot. He was a good man. I could not have asked for a better brother-in-law." Yeah, this was completely cringe, and this is a valid criticism. I mean, that conversation did not need to happen in front of the girl. Did Yassi really figure out that Avery has super strength? Yes, she did. Though he obviously prefers she didn't know that and tries to hide it. Yeah, she was clued in by the fact that apparently he was talking with his grandmother, and his grandmother knows about his powers. And then she gave her own empirical test, and he's trying to blow her off by saying, "Well, I've just been lifting a lot of weights." Why does Avery tell Altona he doesn't care what Jasmine is up to? Isn't what Jasmine's up to the whole point of everything that's happened in the book? Well, he doesn't specifically say that he just doesn't care altogether. He says right now he doesn't care. It's the end of the day. Right now I don't care. We have to look out for us now. I'm out. You need to carry that piece wherever you go. He's just basically going home, and then to regroup, he's going to go pick up his suit. It's been a long day. He's going home to rest. Then he's going to fetch his suit. I mean, I think just when he said, "I'm out," I think Dick Masterson just interpreted that as, "Oh, okay, well, I don't care about this whole thing anymore." Why didn't Avery go back to Darren's club wearing a mask? Well, what good would that have done? I mean, he came back with the intention to get the same info he'd asked about earlier. Darren's either going to think it's him, excuse me, or he's going to think it's somebody who was sent on his behalf. So it doesn't really matter at that point. Avery's getting his suit should have happened in the first 10 pages of the book. Oh, okay, so now it's not okay to start in the past, but it's okay to start in the future? Because he didn't think he would need the suit in the beginning of the book. So you have to be talking at this point about, oh, okay, well, we're going to jump to a future scene in which he's picking up the suit, and then we're going to explain with the rest of the book why he's picking up the suit. I don't actually care much for those kinds of things. I don't like that kind of foreshadowing. And I know one of the most famous movies that's out there right now that does that kind of foreshadowing is John Wick, where the movie starts off with him, crashing his car into a vet's office and then stumbling out and collapsing, and then we're supposed to see like 2 weeks earlier why it is that he's in that condition. I don't really care for things like that, but I mean, this is not this is a weird judgment call here. We never see Avery go through an arc of rejecting and then accepting heroism. Well, this book is part 1 of the ill-advised arc. It says so right on the title page. So, in part 1 of any standard arc, what's usually established is the need to change. You don't have the whole change taking place within the book until you get to, say, the middle part, which would be part 2, which is where we actually do see that change, although I don't really agree that the depiction of that change is presented all that well. And also, we live in the age of decompressed storytelling, so just don't expect a full arc to be present in the book. I mean, we are at the point now, which is really, really sad, that people are writing for a trade, and when you know that your first trade is part of a 3-trade arc, the only thing you can expect is the first part of the arc now, because, like, for example, in when Brian Michael Bendis really instantiated all this decompressed storytelling in Ultimate Spider-Man, you had this whole arc that was being presented straight through, but the breaks between issue and issue were horrible. I mean, it was like there was no real story going on in each individual issue, and that's just the way it's done now, unfortunately. I don't like it either, but that's the world we're living in. I don't understand why Avery needs the suit. Well, it offers either protection or a connection to his old reputation, or both. The protection aspect is indicated by the fact that he can have it absorb or it can be modified to absorb fall damage, so it's almost certain that it has some amount of damage protection in it already, and there's something extra that can be added to that. Can a suit alone make one an accept? Well, this particular suit presumably provides defensive capabilities, but not necessarily offensive capabilities. But I don't see why. I mean, I don't know. Well, that's almost like saying, does Iron Man become a mutant by putting on his Iron Man suit? Well, no. So I don't know that that is actually the case, although he does become kind of a superhuman in a way. But I don't know. This is kind of quibbling over words here. The Norfolk scene doesn't give us enough details. Well, the scene appears intended to imply that much more is heating up in America in general. This side of the Earth has always had abnormal occurrences, but I fear this is a threat that only we can truly comprehend. The return alone is worrisome. So it's like there's things going on, not just in Florispark necessarily, but it could be. But it could also be around the country as well, which is why they're not going to discontinue their tour. They're actually going to continue touring around the country, and if they encounter any other threats along the way, then they'll deal with them at the time. It feels like nothing happens in this book, and seriously? I mean, by the end of the book, Darren is made aware of Avery's powers and makes plans to retaliate. That much is clear. And Avery realizes he's put his family in danger and starts to reestablish his hero identity. So, yeah, things happen. The characters are never challenged. I don't even understand what this means. Avery is challenged with finding out about what happened to Jasmine. Now, it's not a challenge he succeeds at. In the process of doing that, he's challenged with having to defeat Santuan. Manages to defeat Santuan. Well, in the process of accomplishing his defeat of Santuan, he's then challenged with what do I do next, which is picking up his hero identity. And then Darren, as a character, is challenged first by Avery's questions, then by Avery's actions. So now Darren is put in a position where he has to retaliate. Avery's a dick for refusing to return to the city to see his niece now and then. First off, Altona and her daughter live in the suburbs, so they're not even in the city. I mean, we see that when Avery gets back to his truck and then drives off to see Altona, he's leaving the city. By the way, I just noticed that the cars are driving on the wrong side of the road, so this may be a Brazilian thing that we're seeing here. But yeah, that should have been flipped. But her house is out in the suburbs, so it's like, what is the complaint here? And who knows how often he gets out to see her? Now we know it's not as often as the girl would like, but because she's like, I hardly ever get to see you, but we don't actually know how frequently that is, and to a child whose sense of time is obviously distorted just from having such a short life, who knows? Avery shouldn't be paranoid about his family's safety as Darren's done nothing to them yet. Seriously, that's not even how paranoia works. Okay, when you're paranoid about something, you're afraid something's going to happen. I don't see any reason why something wouldn't happen. I mean, Altona's aware of Darren. Why wouldn't Darren be aware of Altona? Ugh. Who are Alpha Corps and what do they do? That's amazing. That's not obvious. Alpha Corps are the Accept Police Division who handle Accept threats. Now, granted, I mean, some of this is probably, knowing this is probably something I absorbed partially off of the websites and other talks that Eric gave, live or on his videos. So it may be that I'm pulling some of this subconsciously, but I do think that's actually implied in the comic as well, because the Alpha Corps comes to the rescue of the police and are wearing a uniform similarly colored to that of the police when they arrive to stop Yaira from beating up on the police. So, Alpha Corps is there as a function of the police to handle the Accept threats that the normal police can't handle. There is no sense of mystery or danger and no ticking clock. Okay, mystery-wise, really? You've been complaining about how little you don't know in this book, and then you're saying there's no sense of mystery. As far as danger goes, I mean, oh my god, just seeing the scene where Avery is being dropped onto a taxi, and granted, this is a completely superfluous scene, but I remember looking at it and thinking, oh, this is gonna hurt. So if you can't get a feeling of danger from that, you've done too many drugs. It's not a time-dependent kind of story until Avery is forced to flee. That's basically correct. I mean, there's no ticking clock because it's not a time-dependent story. I mean, Avery is being forced to flee, and now it's a race against time to see who is going to strike back. Is Avery going to strike back at Darren first, or is Darren going to strike back at Avery or his family first? I was reading that as if it was a criticism, and I didn't realize that was my own rebuttal to the no ticking clock thing. You need to choose what kind of antagonist Darren is. Well, he's a kingpin. He keeps up the image of a respectable businessman while covertly engaging in crime. I mean, he does it pretty well, too. I mean, you kept arguing that I can't see Darren's doing anything wrong. Until, like, the end, where he's basically threatening Avery's family and holding a gun while doing it. So, that's the point where I think they've hopefully communicated to you that he crosses the line and isn't afraid to. Why does the beginning of the series, or rather the beginning of the book, imply crime is down, thus relaxing tension? Well, this is a reference to the governor on the screen saying, we've seen violent crime decrease by 12%, and we're only 6 months into my term. Well, that same scene ends by implying that significant trouble has returned to the city. The woman comes in, boss, she slams the door, and then she hands the news to her boss that somebody's back, and that apparently is a very significant threat that actually ups the tension. The story should start with a dramatic event like a family member's murder. Okay, this is where I think the critique just utterly goes off the rails, because it is not a critic's job to tell the writer to write a different story than what he wrote. The same story, it's important for a critic to tell the writer how to tell the same story better. I am not asking Eric July in any of the critiques that I've done to change all the details such that he's writing a different story altogether. I just want the way he tells the story to change for the better. There's no explanation for why Avery quit being Isom. Well, this is only the first issue. There's at least one more issue to go. There may be more than one, and we know that there's supposed to be a third part of the ill-advised arc. I hope the story ends there, because I'd really like to stop getting Isom after that. We don't even know if Avery left the hero business on good or bad terms. We don't need to know that. What matters right now is that Avery is not interested in returning to the hero business. What's the story behind the costume guy's relationship with Avery? Hey, maybe that'll be explored in issue 2. Again, we don't have to establish every portion of the relationship here, how they know each other, etc., etc. How did the costume guy accumulate all those resources? Really? Because that sounds like a subject for a whole other title, not just, some other book. James Bond movies aren't so coy about the details. Okay, James Bond movies suck, though. I mean, seriously, they do suck. I tried to watch a James Bond movie marathon, starting with Dr. No and moving forward. I couldn't get through it. I couldn't even get through the Sean Connery movies because it was just so bad. By the time I got to From Russia with Love, I was like, oh, this is garbage. No, I actually grew up on the Roger Moore movies, so, maybe I should start with his movies and go from there, since Sean Connery's didn't turn out to be really worth a pot to piss in. But, my God, I mean, the last James Bond movie I remember enjoying, I think, was Die Another Day, although I know that got royally panned, but I thought it at least had a decent plot. GoldenEye was also pretty good. I didn't care for the Daniel Craig movies, so especially, how that series wound up. I mean, it took him three movies to get to the point at which he was actually playing James Bond. Then he had one movie in which he actually got to be Bond, and the next movie he had already quit the service, and this was trying to pull him back in, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to spoil it the way that Comicsgate Kings has spoiled it a couple of times now. But one of the things about Bond films is that they have whole sections entirely devoted to boring exposition. Bond is actually introduced to his target, why he's targeting the person, what his specific mission is, and it just gives you an info dump right at the beginning. And, I tell you, when I'm watching these movies, I've usually forgotten the info dump immediately after Bond leaves Q's office, or not Q's office, M's office. And so the rest of the movie just winds up being a confusing jumble because, all of that stuff that was an info dump is stuff that could have been possibly revealed along the way. I don't, this is not being coy about the details. I mean, James Bond movies aren't coy about the details because they just dump all this information on you and then expect you to enjoy the action in the rest of the movie without thinking anymore. Because we don't know Avery's powers, we can't feel scared for him. Well, the first fight with Darren's men, including Santuan, is what sets that baseline. We realize that Avery is the kind of superpowered individual who can fight off normal men with no problem, even a group of them. But if you get somebody who has powers similar to his, he's not really even mid-range necessarily. So when Santuan puts the beat down on him, we realize that he can indeed be hurt, and especially when Yaira finishes that beat down. There is no relationship between Avery and Santuan, not even former rivalry. Really? You completely missed where Santuan refers to the second fight we've seen as their third fight. So they have fought in the past. He says you wouldn't have to lose 3 consecutive fights for free. So they have fought 3 times, but we've only seen 2 of these fights, because this one that they're about to engage in is the third. Santuan's defeat in the end is not the result of any growth on Avery's part. Well, when Avery first attacks Santuan, when Santuan and Avery first fight, Avery uses his strength alone, and that's all he's got. But then when he acquires Yaira's speed as well, he realizes he has to use that in order to defeat Santuan. So there is at least a little bit of intellectual challenge on Avery's part that he clues into. What is the central theme of Isom number 1? Is that even a valid question to ask? We know this is the first book of a 3-book series. So was the central theme of the Lord of the Rings known from the first book, Fellowship of the Ring. And yes, I did read that, and it bored me to death. I never read the other two books because I got so bored by Fellowship of the Ring that I was like, I'm just not even going to read this. I did see the movies eventually, and Fellowship of the Ring bored me even then. It wasn't until Two Towers that I really got into it, and then I saw Return of the King in the theater, and I thought that was good. A possible central theme for part one is that eventually you'll find your heroic destiny is unavoidable. I mean, that's possible central theme. I don't know that necessarily, but you could kind of imply that. But again, I don't even know that given you're only given the first third of the arc, can you really establish what the central theme is. For a detective story, this book is executed badly. Again, it's not a detective story, and Avery's not a detective. Now, there is a mystery to unfold, but generally the course of events, explained in the most simplest terms, is Avery is just a guy who was sent by his sister to ask a bad man a question. Instead of answering the question, the bad man abused and mistreated Avery. Avery wants to repay the bad man for the abuse, and if Avery is able to get the information requested at the same time, all the better. But it's not hugely a detective story in the sense that, except in the sense that there is a mystery to be found out. We should know everything we need to know about Avery 20 seconds in. I would argue that we do. All you need to know is that he's reluctantly returning to a city that he hates. I mean, it's a little bit of a surprise that he has superpowers. But that's intentional, I would argue. Everything you learn next about Avery comes through what Avery experiences during his return. So, I mean, you get more information along the way as you need it, but you don't get all the information up front. So, I don't agree that you need to know everything about Avery 20 seconds in. I mean, it didn't matter for the first 20 seconds of the book that he has superpowers. I don't see where it does. I mean, if you look through the first portion of the book to where he's going to Darren's club until he evidences that he has superpowers, there's actually no reason to think that he does. There is no traditional arc with rising and falling action, brooding, victory, and for some reason he throws in false victory in the actual notes, and a denouement. Well, this is part one of a multi-part arc. You're not going to get everything in the first part. Comics aren't structured that way anymore. We don't have it where every comic is put through that same arc so that when you're reading a single issue, you're reading a complete story, even in that comic, even when that comic itself is like part one, part two, part three of something else. They used to do things that way. They don't do that anymore. No, I refuse to accept this. I want a full arc. Now, of course, this is paraphrased, but this is the attitude I get. You know, it's like you're just refusing to accept that comics aren't written the way that you think they ought to be written. So, okay, you big baby, how does Isom #1 not fit that traditional structure? It does have rising action. Avery confronts Darren and gets thrashed by Santuan and then by Yaira. The falling action is that Avery escapes the hospital and he finds his truck. Brooding, Avery's angry and he doesn't know what to do next. He's just kind of going around at random. The rising action occurs when Avery finds Jasmine and confronts Santuan a second time. Now, he gets a false victory in that he combines powers old and new to beat Santuan, but he still doesn't have the victory of finding Jasmine and figuring out what her status is. So the falling action is that Avery flees the police, still not knowing Jasmine's condition, and the denouement is he goes and warns his family that they need to be better protected, and he seeks to bolster his own defenses. And there's also the portion where Darren decides he's going to retaliate. But where is the suffering and transformation? Well, Avery had hoped that he could get his answers from Darren and then leave without his life having to change. You know, and that's the way most of us are. It's like we basically, anytime there's a problem that arises, we just like to handle the problem and then go back to our daily lives. But in the end, Avery is forced to retrieve the suit and the hero life he left behind. So things are going to change, and there are events that are out of his control, and he's going to have to step up to those events, and that's the suffering and transformation there. All right, we actually made it through the entire Masterson critique of Isom #1, and I say entire, there actually were a lot of comments that I left out for being kind of unintelligible, but man, that was just a long, long slog. I don't even know how much time I've spent on this. So let's look at the valid criticism that we actually found in all of that. Valid criticism number 1. Earlier should have been now. Valid criticism number 2. Avery just murdered a bodyguard. Yeah, there was way too much blood in that scene. And the criticism number 3. Yassie's dead dad conversation, it didn't need to happen in front of the girls. So, so basically 1, 2, 3 valid criticisms in all of that mess. Now let's go and count all of the invalid criticisms. We had 1, 2, 3, 54. Okay? 54 invalid criticisms of Isom number 1 in that document. And actually, if you count all of the stuff that I didn't even include in here because either it was just so dopey I couldn't even put it in, or just unintelligible, you actually had 74 items. So when we go back to Ethan Van Sciver's assessment and my assessment, and I look and I say, I found that Dick Masterson's critique was 97% useless, we actually have a way to calculate that percentage uselessness now. 74 over 77, leaving out the 3 valid criticisms, is 96.1%. So actually, I was a little hard on Dick Masterson's critique. It was not 97% useless. It was 96% useless and wrong and indicative of not having given the book an actual honest read. So EVS's assessment is just complete crap. It seemed good to him, but it wasn't, because most of Dick Masterson's critique had to do with stuff that was either in the book already to be sussed out, or it had to do with changing the story in ways that would make it a different story altogether. Now, that's not to say, however, that there were no valid criticisms in Dick Masterson's account. And this is where I agree with Ethan Van Sciver that Eric July has a very, very difficult time taking any criticism, aside from what I'd already explained earlier about the time that I had confronted him on a very, very minor issue. These were 3 valid criticisms that if Eric July really, really cared to suss these out of Dick Masterson's pages and pages long complaint, he could have looked at it and said, oh yeah, this perhaps was a bit too far. However, I will say to Eric July's defense that when you've got 3 valid criticisms swimming in a sea of 74 invalid criticisms, how do you pick it out? How do you pick out what it is you're supposed to know? I mean, it seems perfectly valid to me that Eric July, when he looked at Dick Masterson's criticisms and saw how just completely off the wall some of them were, most of them were, the overwhelming majority of them were, that he was like, I can't use any of this. I'm not going to use any of this. I don't have the time to waste trying to pick out the 3 diamonds among all the turds. I honestly don't think that Eric July was necessarily wrong in throwing out the Masterson critique on that basis. But if he's just throwing it out in the sense of, well, this guy's just giving me bad faith criticism, no, that doesn't make any sense. I agree with Ethan Van Sciver there, that it doesn't matter whether the person coming to you with criticism has good faith or bad faith, but they have to be good criticisms too. And I would have at least given this a chance just for the sake of valid criticism number 1 came at like the first page of the Masterson critique. And so just knowing that that was there, although he did not extend it so far as to say that, look, instead of earlier today, if you meant now, you should have said now. I think if he had said that, then maybe Eric July would have perked up and realized, oh, this guy's got a point here. Let me read the rest of this to see that he has any points. But because he still, just basically asked the question, does earlier mean earlier today or even earlier than 2 weeks ago? And Eric July thought that should have been obvious, even though it wasn't. Then I think Eric July just looked at that and said, I'm just writing all this stuff off. So, where can Eric July go to find valid criticism and just lots of valid criticism in a row where he doesn't have to separate out all the invalid criticism? Well, I've got a playlist. I have a Rippaverse playlist, and talking about Isom number 1, I've got videos on Isom number 2, I've got videos on Alpha Core number 1, and I will have videos on Yaira number 1 when it's time for those. I already have a video on the Yaira live action trailer. So there's plenty of material out there if Eric July wants to get some valid criticism from someone who hasn't stuffed his reviews full of invalid criticism. I would highly recommend that he go to my site and give these a watch. So that is my coverage of the Masterson critique. By no means is it the gold standard for critiques of Isom number 1. It should not be used as a reference point. I would suggest using my reviews as a reference point before I would touch this one. There are only 3 gems among all of the pebbles, and we don't really have time for pebblers. All right. Thanks to everyone who has stuck with me through this video. I know it was a long one. I dread to see how much time I spent on it, but I think it was worthwhile. And I appreciate Ethan Van Sciver for having featured this on his channel in one of his trash casts, because that's how I managed to find the reference to it. I don't think I would have found this reference anywhere else. And please do subscribe so that when my Yaira reviews come out, you will be informed of those. I am currently reviewing Andy Smith's Kordrath the Reckoning. My first video on that is already out, and soon I will be back to reviewing Ethan Van Sciver's Cyberfrog 2, Wrecked Planet. And at that point, I think Yaira will have definitely come out by then. I think it'll be slow-going enough through those 2 books that Yaira number 1 will be the next one that I review. And I wish I could say that I was looking forward to that, but I have a feeling it's not going to be any less of a crap show than the other books have been. So, yeah. You can come and, vomit along with me, and maybe the Soshka sisters will actually appreciate that. All right. Thank you again for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and I will talk to you later.